It's bad for him legally. I don't know that it's bad for him politically in seeking the Republican nomination. But if you read that indictment, it's what we call a speaking indictment. So you now know the evidence that the prosecutors are going to put into evidence against him. The pictures are there, the tapes are there.
Yeah.
And it strikes me as a very, very strong case. He's in big trouble legally.
Legally, because one of his attorney generals, Barr, said that he's toast as far as these indictments are.
Yeah, I hate to agree with Bill Barr, but on this I will. That I think anybody who cares to understand it, after reading it, will understand he's in big trouble.
And because though you said, you mentioned the difference between legal trouble and political trouble, because he's saying that even if indicted, even if charged, even if convicted, he's still going to run as president. Is that possible under the American Constitution?
It is. Being convicted of a felony might actually prevent him from voting for himself, but it doesn't. It does not prevent him from being a candidate for office. Yeah. Now, and
it's one less thing for him to think about, isn't it?
Right. A lot on his plate.
Yes.
Yeah. But we're in such. If you wrote this in a screenplay, it would get rejected. That the Republican Party might nominate such a person, but I think they might.
Oh, I'm so glad I'm not writing Veep at the moment, because so much of what's happening now is... But there he is, gaining momentum and traction and, turning it into the Donald Trump show by saying there's no evidence, they've got nothing on me, while pictures of classified documents in boxes in his bathroom have been released. And we're at that stage, because I mentioned the Hillary Clinton email thing, we'll get onto that. That seemed so important, and people were getting very, very worked up about it at the time, that she might have used emails or sent emails on a personal server rather than... This is the nuclear codes sitting in his shower. And yet, why hasn't the world caved in? What's happened in those 4 or 5 years to turn that climate into one where the reality is not something that people take seriously?
Because as to his supporters, which are a distinct minority of Americans, it's not about facts. They've been drawn into a cult, really, and so there's no way out for them. And every bad fact is painful for them if they stare at it, and so they turn away. January 6th, the TV whispers to them, "You fool, look what you did, you fool." Very few people can stare at that. Most turn away. I've had cases where fraud victims showed up to support the fraudster at sentencing because it's so hard to admit about yourself that I was a fool. And so there are millions of Americans for whom it doesn't matter. What you just said is absolutely true about the difference between this and the Clinton case. It doesn't matter because it's not about the facts for those folks. And so there's nothing really to be done about that slice of his followers. They'll drift away eventually, write another story, just as when Nixon resigned, 30-some% supported him. But they found a way to drift away from him, and that's what it'll take with that hardcore group.
But will he drift away in time for the next election, or is there still a real danger?
I think it's a real prospect that he will be the Republican nominee for president. I think it is very unlikely that the American people, even in our slightly odd electoral vote system, would elect Donald Trump, but it's a non-zero chance, which is why it's so important the American people focus on what's going to be on the ballot next year. And in a way, they're not going to be able to avoid focusing because he'll be front and center in our lives again.
Talking front and center, I mean, you've met the guy up close, most notoriously at a dinner or a lunch where he sat you down and asked you as head of the FBI to go easy, to lay off, you mentioned it's like the language of a mobster, really, that sense of go easy on my guys, keep them, that's bad stereotype Italian mafia, New York. I actually, I'm going to make a complaint against myself for that, sorry. But what, I mean, talk us through that moment then, when you're up close with somebody.
Well, that was actually the so-called loyalty dinner. We were sitting as close as you and I are, alone. They had pushed all the furniture off to the side of this cavernous green room on the ground floor, the first floor, of the residence at the White House.
Why?
I don't know why.
It's
but
ominous.
Just gigantic rug with a tiny table, and we faced each other. And he asked for directly asked me to promise loyalty to him. And I was so surprised by it, all I could think to do was stare at the man. And so 1 beat, 2 beats, 3 beats of silence, and then he looked down and started eating again and came back to it. But the purpose of that dinner was for me to promise him that I was his FBI director. And so I didn't focus much on the food, because the rest of the time I was trying to make sure that I didn't say anything that would reinforce that idea.
Do you think, I mean, there were no notes taken, would there be notes taken at that lunch, or would you take notes afterwards?
The moment I got in my armored car, I started writing down everything that had been said.
Okay.
Because I knew how significant that was. And I knew that it was really the end between the two of us, because I wouldn't give him what he wanted. And it wasn't just the stare, but to tell Donald Trump anything, you almost always have to interrupt him. And so I interrupted him to tell him, here's how it has to work, why it's so important to have the Department of Justice have an independent spirit from the president. The American people have wanted it for 50 years, since J. Edgar Hoover, and he was focused on his ice cream or something, so it didn't get through.
When you say you had to interrupt him, is that what he's like then? Is it just is it a kind of long flow of any word that comes into his head? What's the...
Yeah, it's a long, again, in my experience, it's a long verbal search for affirmation. So he's just constantly telling you things and then saying, right, I'm right about that, I'm right about that. And probably the tensest moment that we had was he was trying to get me, sitting in the Oval Office, to agree that what he had said about Putin was fine, when he had said, you know, America, we're killers too. And I wouldn't agree. And I said, Mr. President, actually, I think that's wrong. And that's not a good description of the way we conduct ourselves. And it was almost like a shadow crossed the room at that moment. And so I was surprised the day I was fired. I shouldn't have been surprised to be fired.
How did you get the news?
I was talking to employees in the Los Angeles field office, and I was a big audience of FBI people, and behind in this training room there were 3 televisions with no sound on, tuned to news channels. And while I'm speaking, I start to notice that, and the first one that picked, I have to relive this right now, unfortunately. But
We've got the TV monitors here.
It said on the TVs, it said, Comey resigns.
Yes.
And so you all don't know this, but there's a lot of very funny people in the FBI. And so I thought it was a practical joke.
Okay.
And so I turned to the head of the LA office, a woman that I had promoted who I thought the world of, and I said, that took a lot of work. And then I kept talking, and then because I wasn't going to let them get the better of me, so I wanted to be a good sport. So I kept talking, and then I noticed it now said, Comey fired across all of them, and I thought, nah, they're not going to go there. And so now all the employees are turning around, looking at the screens, and I said, look, I don't know whether that's true or not. I'm going to go find out, but it doesn't change what I want to say to you. And so I said some things about the quality of their work, and then I walked out.
You could have maintained the lie. You could have taken a cue from your own president. And just like, that didn't happen. It was all lies, fake news, mainstream media. Didn't happen. I'm still here.
I wish you'd been there.
No, I'm not going to leave. And did you get a leaving present, or did you?
I did not. I was allowed to fly home on the FBI aircraft, which infuriated Trump. He called my deputy, who immediately became the acting director, and said he wanted an investigation as to how I was allowed to come home on an FBI plane. And the deputy said, like, I could investigate it, but I can tell you the answer right now. I authorized it. We're responsible for his protection. We can't leave him in L.A. But Trump was furious about that.
Yeah, see, that is an episode of Succession, I think. I think one of the Roys takes a plane, and another Roy says he's not allowed to do that. But actually, the resign behind you, I think we did do that in the thick of it. We didn't do it in Veep, but we did do Malcolm Tucker says he's not resigning, but the news comes on right behind him.
It's funny now.
It's funny.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you said, but actually when you had the lunch, you kind of thought that is it, though, didn't you? That the tide has turned and...
Yeah, when I wouldn't I mean, the purpose of that was to extract a promise from me that I would be no threat to him or any of his people. And then when I wouldn't agree to dump the case against Michael Flynn, that was the second stone in the load. And then the third, I think, was when I interrupted him to tell him he was wrong about Putin and America. And then the fourth was he wanted me to say publicly he wasn't under investigation, and I wouldn't do it. And so, and here's the way I misinterpreted it. I thought, he hates me, good, because that means there'll be a distance between us. He won't be inviting me over for dinner anymore. But it tipped over into sort of an irrational, I need to get rid of this guy.